The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned streets of New Haven as Marcus Rodriguez crouched behind the rusted remains of a delivery truck, his weathered hands gripping a makeshift spear fashioned from a broken street sign. The silence was deceptive, broken only by the distant groaning that had become the soundtrack of their new reality. 3 years had passed since the outbreak began, 3 years since the dead had risen to reclaim the earth from the living, and Marcus had learned that silence often preceded the storm. His dark eyes scanned the intersection ahead, searching for any sign of movement among the scattered debris and overturned vehicles that littered what had once been Main Street. The acrid smell of decay hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of how quickly their world had crumbled. Behind him, he could hear the soft breathing of his companions, fellow survivors who had banded together not out of choice, but out of necessity. There was Elena Vasquez, a former nurse whose medical knowledge had kept them alive through countless injuries and infections, her steady hands now as skilled with a crossbow as they had once been with a scalpel. Beside her crouched Tommy Mitchell, barely 19 but aged beyond his years by the horrors he had witnessed, his youthful face marked by scars that told stories of narrow escapes and desperate fights. The youngest of their group, Rebecca Walsh, clutched a modified baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire, her blonde hair tied back in a practical ponytail that kept it away from grasping undead fingers. She had been a college student when the world ended, studying literature and dreaming of becoming a teacher, but now her education consisted of learning the most efficient ways to destroy the walking corpses that had once been her neighbors, friends, and family. The group had been tracking rumors for weeks. Whispers passed between survivor settlements about something unprecedented happening in the Eastern Territories. Reports spoke of zombies moving with purpose, organizing in ways that defied everything they thought they knew about the undead. Traditional zombies were mindless, driven only by an insatiable hunger for human flesh, but these new accounts described creatures that seemed to plan, to coordinate, to think. Marcus had initially dismissed such stories as the fevered imaginings of traumatized minds, but as more survivors arrived at their settlement with similar tales, he began to take notice. The descriptions were too consistent, too detailed to be mere hallucinations or wishful thinking. Witnesses spoke of zombies that moved in formation, that used tools, that seemed to communicate with each other through a series of guttural sounds and gestures. Most disturbing of all were the reports of a massive gathering, hundreds of thousands of undead converging on a single location, creating what survivors had begun calling the Undead Empire. The very concept sent chills down Marcus's spine, challenging everything he believed about their enemy and forcing him to confront the possibility that humanity's fight for survival had just become infinitely more complicated. As the leader of one of the largest remaining human settlements, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on his shoulders like a physical burden. New Haven had grown from a handful of desperate survivors hiding in an abandoned shopping mall to a thriving community of over 200 people, complete with gardens, workshops, and even a small school for the children who had been born into this nightmare world. They had built walls, established patrols, and created a semblance of normal life within their protected borders, but Marcus knew that their safety was an illusion, a temporary reprieve in an ongoing war they were slowly losing. The zombie horde seemed endless, their numbers replenished by every human who fell in battle or succumbed to infection, while humanity's numbers dwindled with each passing day. Every loss was irreplaceable, every death a blow to their collective hope for the future. The settlement's council had debated for hours about whether to investigate these new reports, with some arguing that they should focus on defending what they had rather than venturing into unknown dangers. Others, led by Marcus, believed that knowledge was their greatest weapon, that understanding this new threat was essential to their long-term survival. The decision to form a reconnaissance team had not been made lightly, and Marcus had hand-picked each member for their specific skills and unwavering courage. Elena's medical expertise could mean the difference between life and death if anyone was injured, while Tommy's youth and agility made him an excellent scout and messenger. Rebecca's fierce determination and natural fighting instincts had saved the group more times than Marcus could count, and her ability to remain calm under pressure was invaluable in their dangerous world. Together, they represented the best of what humanity had to offer, a small but determined force willing to risk everything for the chance to protect their people and perhaps find a way to turn the tide in their favor. As they prepared to move deeper into zombie-controlled territory, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than they had ever encountered before, but he also knew that retreat was not an option. The future of human civilization might very well depend on what they discovered in the coming days, and failure was a luxury they simply could not afford. The abandoned warehouse district stretched before them like a concrete graveyard, its skeletal remains of industrial buildings casting ominous shadows in the afternoon light. Marcus signaled for his team to halt as they approached the perimeter of what their intelligence suggested was the outer edge of the Undead Empire's territory. The air itself seemed different here, thick with an oppressive atmosphere that made breathing feel labored and unnatural. Elena wiped sweat from her brow despite the cool temperature, her medical training making her acutely aware of how their bodies were responding to the stress and fear that permeated this forsaken place. The silence was absolute, lacking even the usual sounds of scavenging animals or rustling vegetation that had become commonplace in other abandoned areas. It was as if life itself had been systematically drained from this region, leaving behind only the hollow shells of human civilization and something far more sinister lurking in the shadows. Tommy crept forward on silent feet, his natural agility allowing him to navigate the debris-strewn ground without making a sound. His sharp eyes caught movement in the distance, and he quickly retreated to the group, his face pale with a mixture of excitement and terror. The zombies he had observed were unlike anything they had encountered before, moving with deliberate purpose rather than the aimless wandering they had grown accustomed to seeing. These creatures walked in loose formations, their decaying heads turning in coordinated sweeps as if they were conducting organized patrols of their territory. Most disturbing of all, they seemed to be wearing crude armor fashioned from scavenged materials, metal plates, and leather straps bound to their rotting bodies in a grotesque parody of military gear. The implications were staggering and forced the team to reconsider everything they thought they knew about zombie behavior and capabilities. Rebecca gripped her weapon tighter as Tommy relayed his observations, her mind racing with tactical considerations and strategic implications. If the zombies were truly organizing and equipping themselves, it meant they possessed a level of intelligence and planning ability that made them exponentially more dangerous than the mindless hordes they had been fighting for years. The traditional tactics of noise distraction and simple barricades would be useless against an enemy that could think, plan, and adapt to human strategies. She found herself wondering about the source of this transformation, whether it was a natural evolution of the zombie virus or something more deliberate and controlled. The thought that there might be a guiding intelligence behind this undead army sent chills down her spine and made her question whether humanity stood any real chance of survival against such an organized threat. As they moved deeper into the territory, the evidence of zombie organization became increasingly undeniable and terrifying. Crude but effective fortifications had been constructed from salvaged materials, creating defensive positions that showed clear understanding of military principles and strategic thinking. The zombies had even established what appeared to be supply lines, with groups of undead moving in coordinated patterns that suggested they were transporting resources and information between different locations. Marcus observed these activities with growing alarm, realizing that they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented in human history, an undead civilization that threatened to eclipse and replace their own. The zombies were not just surviving, they were thriving and expanding, building an empire that grew stronger with each human settlement they conquered and each survivor they converted to their ranks. Elena made careful notes of everything they observed, her scientific mind trying to process the implications of what they were witnessing while her survival instincts screamed warnings about the danger they were in. The medical knowledge that had served her so well in treating human injuries and illnesses seemed woefully inadequate when faced with an enemy that had transcended the normal limitations of death and decay. She began to wonder if there were different types of zombies within this empire, perhaps a hierarchy based on intelligence or physical capabilities that allowed for the complex organization they were observing. The possibility that some zombies retained more of their human cognitive abilities than others opened up terrifying new questions about the nature of the infection and whether it might be possible for the undead to continue evolving and adapting over time. The team's reconnaissance mission took on new urgency as they realized the scope and sophistication of what they were facing. This was not simply a large gathering of zombies, but a genuine threat to human survival that required immediate action and coordination between all remaining human settlements. Marcus knew that their small community, no matter how well defended, would be helpless against an organized zombie army of this magnitude and capability. The only hope for humanity lay in uniting all survivors under a single banner, pooling their resources and knowledge to mount a coordinated defense against this emerging threat. As the sun began to set and the zombie patrols became more active, the team prepared to withdraw and carry their dire intelligence back to New Haven, knowing that the information they had gathered would change everything about humanity's fight for survival and force them to confront the possibility that they were no longer the dominant species on Earth. The journey back to New Haven felt like a race against time itself, with each mile covered bringing them closer to safety while the weight of their discoveries pressed heavily on their minds. Marcus pushed the pace relentlessly, knowing that every hour they delayed in delivering their intelligence could mean the difference between preparation and catastrophe for their community. The zombie patrols they had observed were clearly expanding their territory, probing outward from their central stronghold in search of new resources and potential threats to eliminate. Elena struggled to keep up with the grueling pace, her medical bag bouncing against her hip as she fought to process the implications of what they had witnessed through the lens of her scientific training. The organized behavior they had documented defied every established understanding of zombie physiology and neurology, suggesting that the infection had undergone some form of evolutionary leap that restored cognitive function while maintaining the physical advantages of undeath. Tommy served as their advanced scout, his youthful energy and natural stealth allowing him to range ahead of the group and identify potential dangers before they became deadly encounters. His observations during their retreat painted an increasingly disturbing picture of zombie expansion, with evidence of recent undead activity appearing in areas that had been clear just days before. The creatures were not simply growing in number, they were actively claiming territory and establishing permanent footholds in regions that had previously been considered safe for human travel. Rebecca maintained rear guard, her weapon ready and her senses alert for any signs of pursuit, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by unseen eyes that tracked their movement with predatory intelligence. The traditional zombie behavior of immediate pursuit and attack seemed to have been replaced by something far more calculating and patient, as if their enemies were content to observe and gather information rather than engage in direct confrontation. The implications of their discoveries extended far beyond military strategy and into the very foundations of human survival in the post-apocalyptic world. If zombies could organize, plan, and adapt, then every assumption about safe zones, defensive strategies, and long-term survival needed to be completely re-evaluated and restructured. Marcus found himself questioning whether their settlements' walls and defenses, which had seemed so formidable against mindless hordes, would prove adequate against an enemy that could conduct siege warfare and coordinate complex attacks. The zombie empire represented not just a physical threat, but a fundamental challenge to humanity's belief that intelligence and technology would ultimately triumph over brute force and numbers. The undead had somehow acquired the benefits of human cognitive ability while retaining their supernatural resilience and infectious nature, creating a hybrid enemy that combined the worst aspects of both living and dead adversaries. As they approached the familiar landmarks that marked the outer boundaries of New Haven's territory, the team began to encounter other survivor groups fleeing from the eastern regions with tales of horror and destruction that corroborated their own observations. Entire settlements had been overrun not by chaotic zombie swarms, but by coordinated attacks that demonstrated clear tactical planning and strategic thinking. Survivors spoke of zombies that used tools and weapons, that set traps and ambushes, that seemed to learn from each encounter and adapt their methods accordingly. The refugees painted a picture of an undead army that was not only growing in size but also increasing in sophistication and effectiveness with each victory they achieved. Most terrifying of all were the reports of zombies that appeared to be communicating with each other through complex vocalizations and gestures, suggesting the development of a rudimentary but functional language that allowed for coordination and information sharing across vast distances. Elena interviewed the refugees with clinical detachment, documenting their accounts and searching for patterns that might provide insight into the nature of this zombie evolution. The consistency of the reports from multiple independent sources left no doubt that they were dealing with a genuine transformation rather than mass hysteria or exaggerated rumors. Her medical training led her to hypothesize that the zombie virus had somehow stabilized and begun to restore certain brain functions while leaving others dormant, creating creatures that retain strategic thinking and problem-solving abilities while losing emotional responses and moral constraints. The possibility that this evolution was continuing and accelerating filled her with dread, as it suggested that the zombies might eventually develop capabilities that surpassed even living humans in certain areas. The gates of New Haven appeared ahead of them like a beacon of hope in an increasingly dark world, but Marcus knew that their arrival marked the beginning of an even greater challenge than their reconnaissance mission had been. The information they carried would shatter the community's sense of security and force difficult decisions about their future survival strategy. The choice between fighting an impossible war against an evolving enemy or abandoning everything they had built to seek safety in more remote regions would tear the settlement apart and test the bonds that held their community together. As they approached the guards at the main gate, Marcus steeled himself for the conversations that lay ahead, knowing that the next few hours would determine whether New Haven would stand as a fortress against the Undead Empire or become another casualty in humanity's losing battle for survival. The emergency council meeting convened within an hour of the team's return, the community's leaders gathering in the fortified conference room that had once been the manager's office of the shopping mall. Marcus stood before the assembled group, his weathered face grave as he prepared to deliver intelligence that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the threat they faced. Council members shifted uncomfortably in their salvaged office chairs, sensing the gravity of the situation from the tension radiating from the reconnaissance team. Dr. Patricia Williams, the settlement's chief medical officer and Elena's mentor, leaned forward with scientific curiosity mixed with growing concern as she studied the exhausted faces of the returning scouts. James Harrison, the former military officer who served as their defense coordinator, maintained his stoic expression while his tactical mind began processing the implications of what he was about to hear. The revelation of organized zombie forces sent shockwaves through the council chamber, with several members initially refusing to accept the possibility that their undead enemies had evolved beyond mindless hunger. Marcus methodically presented their evidence, describing the coordinated patrols, crude fortifications, and apparent communication systems they had observed during their reconnaissance mission. Elena supplemented his report with her medical analysis, explaining how the zombie virus might have undergone mutations that restored cognitive function while maintaining the physical advantages of undeath. The scientific implications were staggering, suggesting that they were no longer fighting a plague of reanimated corpses but rather a new species that combined human intelligence with supernatural resilience and an insatiable drive to expand their territory and convert the living to their ranks. Rebecca's first-hand account of zombie tool use and tactical coordination provided concrete details that made the threat impossible to dismiss or minimize. She described watching undead sentries communicate through a series of guttural sounds and hand gestures, coordinating their movements with a precision that rivaled trained military units. The zombies had not only learned to use weapons and armor but had begun manufacturing crude equipment from salvaged materials, demonstrating problem-solving abilities that challenged every assumption about their mental capabilities. Tommy's observations of zombie supply lines and territorial expansion painted a picture of an empire that was actively growing and consolidating its power, preparing for conflicts that extended far beyond simple feeding behavior. The council erupted into heated debate as the implications of this intelligence became clear, with some members advocating for immediate evacuation while others insisted on strengthening their defenses and preparing for siege warfare. Harrison's military experience led him to recognize the tactical advantages that organized zombies would possess, including their immunity to fatigue, fear, and conventional psychological warfare tactics. The Undead Empire could sustain prolonged campaigns that would exhaust human defenders, using their supernatural endurance to wear down resistance through attrition rather than direct assault. Dr. Williams raised concerns about the medical implications of fighting an enemy that could potentially learn from each encounter, adapting their strategies based on human defensive measures and developing countermeasures to traditional zombie fighting techniques. The debate intensified as reports from refugee groups continued to arrive, each account adding new details to the growing picture of zombie organization and expansion. Survivors described undead forces that used diversionary tactics, flanking maneuvers, and coordinated attacks that demonstrated clear understanding of military strategy and battlefield dynamics. Some refugees reported seeing zombies that appeared to hold leadership positions, directing other undead through complex communication systems and making tactical decisions based on changing battlefield conditions. The possibility that a hierarchy existed within the zombie empire raised terrifying questions about the extent of their cognitive restoration and whether some undead individuals might possess intelligence levels that matched or exceeded those of living humans. As the night wore on, the Council gradually reached a consensus that their current defensive posture was inadequate against this new threat and that radical action was necessary to ensure their community's survival. The choice between evacuation and fortification gave way to a third option proposed by Marcus, a desperate plan to unite all remaining human settlements in a coordinated resistance against the Undead Empire. The proposal required sending envoys to every known survivor community, sharing their intelligence and attempting to forge alliances that had previously been impossible due to distance, mistrust, and competing resource needs. Harrison began sketching preliminary plans for a unified human military force, while Dr. Williams started developing protocols for sharing medical knowledge and zombie research between settlements. The magnitude of the undertaking was overwhelming, but the alternative of facing the Undead Empire as isolated communities virtually guaranteed extinction for the human species. As dawn approached and the council meeting finally concluded, New Haven prepared to transform from an isolated sanctuary into the potential headquarters of humanity's last stand against an enemy that had evolved beyond their worst nightmares. The first convoy of envoys departed New Haven at dawn, their vehicles loaded with precious fuel and supplies that represented a significant sacrifice for the community's dwindling resources. Marcus had divided his most trusted people among 3 separate missions, each tasked with reaching different clusters of survivor settlements scattered across the wasteland. Captain Harrison led the northern expedition toward the mountain communities that had established themselves in abandoned ski resorts and mining towns, their elevated positions offering natural defensive advantages against traditional zombie hordes. Dr. Williams accompanied the southern team, her medical expertise serving as both credential and bargaining chip when negotiating with settlements that had grown suspicious of outsiders and their potential diseases. Elena volunteered for the most dangerous mission, heading east toward the coastal settlements that lay closest to the expanding zombie empire, where her first-hand knowledge of the undead evolution would carry the most weight with communities already under direct threat. The responses from contacted settlements varied dramatically, reflecting the diverse survival strategies and leadership philosophies that had emerged during 3 years of apocalyptic struggle. Some communities embraced the alliance proposal immediately, their leaders recognizing that cooperation represented their only hope against an organized undead threat that could overwhelm isolated defenses through sheer coordination and persistence. Others rejected the concept entirely, arguing that large gatherings of humans would only attract zombie attention and create targets too valuable for the Undead Empire to ignore. The mountain settlements proved particularly resistant to alliance, their leaders convinced that geographic isolation and natural barriers would protect them from any zombie organization, regardless of its sophistication or tactical capabilities. Rebecca remained at New Haven to coordinate communications and prepare the settlement for its potential role as a central command center for the emerging human alliance. Her youth and energy proved invaluable as she worked tirelessly to establish radio networks, organize supply chains, and develop protocols for integrating diverse groups of survivors into a cohesive fighting force. The technical challenges were immense, requiring the coordination of different communication systems, weapon types, and tactical doctrines that had evolved independently in isolated communities. Each settlement had developed its own methods for dealing with zombies, from noise-based distraction techniques to elaborate trap systems, and finding ways to combine these approaches into unified strategies required creativity and diplomatic skill that tested everyone involved in the planning process. Tommy served as a courier between the various negotiation teams, his speed and stealth allowing him to carry messages and updates across dangerous territory where radio communications might be intercepted or jammed by unknown zombie capabilities. His reports painted a complex picture of human survival, with some communities thriving through careful resource management and defensive planning while others barely clung to existence in fortified positions that could be overrun by any significant zombie assault. The diversity of human responses to the apocalypse had created a patchwork of settlements with vastly different capabilities, populations, and strategic value, making the task of forging effective alliances exponentially more complicated than simple military coordination. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source when Elena's Eastern expedition encountered a group of former military personnel who had established a sophisticated intelligence network throughout the zombie-controlled territories. Colonel Sarah Mitchell, a career officer who had survived the initial outbreak through a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless pragmatism, possessed detailed maps of zombie movements and organizational structures that confirmed and expanded upon New Haven's reconnaissance findings. Her intelligence revealed that the Undead Empire was far larger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined, with multiple regional commands coordinating activities across vast territories and specialized zombie units adapted for different tactical roles. The military survivors had been conducting guerrilla operations against zombie forces for months, gathering intelligence and disrupting undead supply lines while searching for other human groups capable of mounting organized resistance. Colonel Mitchell's arrival at New Haven transformed the alliance negotiations from desperate appeals for cooperation into serious military planning sessions focused on realistic strategies for combating an organized undead threat. Her professional assessment of zombie capabilities and weaknesses provided the foundation for developing tactics that could exploit the Undead Empire's reliance on coordination and communication systems. The Colonel's maps revealed potential weak points in zombie territorial control, including supply bottlenecks and communication nodes that could be targeted through coordinated strikes designed to disrupt their organizational structure. Most importantly, her intelligence suggested that the zombie evolution was still ongoing and potentially unstable, creating opportunities for human forces to exploit biological vulnerabilities before the undead could adapt and overcome their remaining weaknesses. The alliance began to take concrete shape as settlements committed resources and personnel to the unified resistance effort, with New Haven serving as the primary coordination center for what was rapidly becoming humanity's largest military operation since the outbreak began. Weapons and ammunition flowed in from communities that had focused on manufacturing and scavenging, while food and medical supplies arrived from agricultural settlements that had successfully maintained farming operations despite zombie threats. The logistical complexity of supporting a multi-settlement military campaign required unprecedented cooperation and trust between groups that had previously competed for scarce resources, but the existential threat posed by the Undead Empire provided powerful motivation for overcoming traditional barriers to collaboration and mutual support. The first coordinated strike against the Undead Empire launched under cover of darkness, with human forces moving simultaneously against 3 separate zombie outposts that Colonel Mitchell's intelligence had identified as critical communication nodes. Marcus led the primary assault team toward a fortified position that had once been a radio tower facility, now serving as a relay point for zombie coordination across the Eastern Territories. The attack required precise timing and flawless execution, as any delay or failure would alert the entire undead network to humanity's newfound organizational capabilities and tactical sophistication. Elena accompanied the strike force as their medical officer, her field surgery skills essential for treating combat injuries in an environment where evacuation to proper medical facilities was impossible and infection from zombie contact remained a constant threat. The assault revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of the evolved zombie forces, as human fighters encountered undead defenders that responded to attacks with tactical awareness and coordinated counterstrikes. The zombies had established overlapping fields of fire using crude but effective weapons, and their defensive positions showed clear understanding of military engineering principles despite being constructed from salvaged materials. However, their reliance on coordination also created vulnerabilities that experienced human fighters could exploit through rapid movement and unpredictable assault patterns that disrupted zombie communication and command structures. Rebecca's team successfully infiltrated the facility's perimeter by exploiting gaps in zombie patrol routes, demonstrating that the undead forces, despite their organization, still lacked the intuitive tactical flexibility that characterized experienced human soldiers. The battle for the communication node became a brutal close-quarters engagement that tested every survival skill the human fighters had developed during 3 years of apocalyptic warfare. Zombies fought with supernatural endurance and fearlessness, pressing attacks even when suffering damage that would incapacitate living opponents, but their tactical responses remained predictable and mechanical compared to human adaptability and creative problem-solving. Tommy's agility and speed proved crucial in the confined spaces of the facility, as he darted between zombie defenders to plant explosive charges on critical equipment while his teammates provided covering fire and distraction. The destruction of the communication array sent visible shockwaves through the zombie forces, as undead units throughout the region began exhibiting confused and uncoordinated behavior that suggested their command structure had been severely disrupted. The success of the coordinated strikes provided humanity with its first major victory against the organized zombie threat, but the celebration was tempered by sobering intelligence about the true scope of the Undead Empire's capabilities and resources. Colonel Mitchell's post-battle analysis revealed that the destroyed communication nodes represented only a small fraction of the zombie network, and that the undead forces were already adapting their procedures to compensate for the loss of centralized coordination. The zombies had begun implementing redundant communication systems and decentralized command structures that would make future disruption efforts significantly more difficult and dangerous. Most concerning was evidence that the zombie leadership had anticipated human resistance and had prepared contingency plans that suggested a level of strategic thinking that rivaled the best human military minds. Dr. Williams' examination of zombie remains from the battle provided disturbing insights into the continuing evolution of the undead threat, as she discovered evidence of recent biological changes that enhanced their cognitive abilities while maintaining their supernatural physical advantages. The zombie brain tissue showed signs of regeneration and reorganization that defied conventional understanding of neurology and death, suggesting that the infection was actively repairing and improving neural pathways rather than simply reanimating dead tissue. Her findings indicated that the zombies were not only learning from their encounters with human forces but were also undergoing accelerated evolution that could eventually produce undead individuals with intelligence levels that surpassed living humans in certain areas. The intelligence gathered from the raids forced the human alliance to confront the possibility that they were fighting a losing battle against an enemy that was evolving faster than humanity could adapt its strategies and tactics. The zombie empire's ability to learn from defeats and implement countermeasures meant that each human victory would become progressively more difficult to achieve, while the undead forces grew stronger and more sophisticated with each passing day. Colonel Mitchell began developing contingency plans for a strategic withdrawal to more defensible positions, while settlement leaders debated whether to continue offensive operations or focus on creating impregnable strongholds that could survive prolonged siege warfare against an increasingly capable enemy. The revelation that some zombies were beginning to exhibit problem-solving abilities that exceeded their original human intelligence created panic among the Alliance leadership, as it suggested that the undead evolution might eventually produce creatures capable of technological innovation and scientific advancement. The possibility of zombies developing new weapons, communication systems, or even biological enhancements represented a nightmare scenario that could render human resistance completely futile within a matter of months or years. As reports arrived of zombie forces conducting their own reconnaissance missions and adapting their tactics based on human defensive measures, the Alliance faced the terrifying realization that they might be witnessing the birth of a new dominant species that would eventually replace humanity as the planet's primary intelligent life form. The zombie counterattack came with devastating swiftness and coordination that exceeded even Colonel Mitchell's worst-case projections, as undead forces launched simultaneous assaults against 5 human settlements within a span of 12 hours. The attacks demonstrated tactical sophistication that suggested the zombie leadership had not only learned from their recent defeats but had also been conducting extensive surveillance of human alliance activities and defensive preparations. Marcus received frantic radio transmissions from settlement commanders describing zombie forces that employed siege tactics, diversionary maneuvers, and coordinated artillery strikes using improvised weapons that showed clear understanding of ballistics and engineering principles. The undead had somehow acquired or developed the ability to manufacture explosive devices and projectile weapons that rivaled human military equipment in effectiveness while surpassing it in the fearlessness of their operators. Elena found herself treating casualties from multiple fronts as wounded fighters were evacuated to New Haven's medical facilities, their injuries telling a horrifying story of zombie tactical evolution and increasing lethality. The undead forces were no longer simply overwhelming human defenses through numbers and persistence, but were actively targeting key personnel and infrastructure with precision that suggested detailed intelligence gathering and strategic planning. Wounded soldiers reported encountering zombie units that seemed specialized for different combat roles, including heavily armored assault troops, agile infiltrators, and what appeared to be undead commanders that directed battlefield operations through complex communication systems. Most disturbing were accounts of zombies that had learned to use captured human weapons and equipment, turning humanity's own technological advantages against them with deadly effectiveness. The fall of Riverside Settlement sent shockwaves through the Alliance as reports arrived describing the complete overrun of a community that had been considered one of the most defensible positions in the region. The zombie assault had begun with coordinated strikes against the settlement's power grid and communication systems, followed by simultaneous breaches at multiple points along the perimeter that overwhelmed defensive positions through sheer tactical brilliance rather than brute force. Survivors who managed to escape painted a picture of zombie forces that had studied human defensive patterns and developed specific countermeasures for every obstacle they encountered. The undead had even demonstrated the ability to operate captured vehicles and heavy equipment, using bulldozers and construction machinery to breach fortifications that had previously been considered impregnable. Rebecca coordinated the desperate evacuation efforts as settlement after settlement fell to the zombie onslaught, her communication skills proving essential for organizing refugee movements and resource allocation under impossible circumstances. The human alliance was rapidly fragmenting under the pressure of coordinated zombie attacks that seemed designed to prevent effective cooperation and mutual support between surviving communities. Each settlement that fell provided the Undead Empire with additional resources, equipment, and intelligence about human capabilities and weaknesses, creating a snowball effect that accelerated zombie tactical development while simultaneously weakening human resistance. The refugees brought tales of zombie forces that had begun constructing permanent fortifications and infrastructure, suggesting that the undead were no longer simply conquering territory but were actively building a civilization to replace the human world they were systematically destroying. Tommy's reconnaissance missions revealed the true scope of the zombie transformation as he observed undead forces engaging in activities that defied every assumption about their nature and capabilities. The zombies had established manufacturing facilities where they produced weapons, armor, and equipment using salvaged materials and what appeared to be original engineering designs. Some undead individuals seemed to have retained or developed technical skills that allowed them to repair and modify complex machinery, while others demonstrated artistic and creative abilities that suggested the restoration of higher cognitive functions previously thought impossible in reanimated tissue. Most shocking was the discovery of zombie agricultural operations, where undead workers tended crops and livestock in a grotesque parody of human farming that indicated long-term planning and resource management capabilities. Colonel Mitchell's strategic assessment painted a grim picture of humanity's prospects as the zombie empire continued its rapid expansion and evolution, with undead forces now controlling over 60% of the former United States and showing no signs of slowing their conquest. The military intelligence suggested that the zombies had developed a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and were deliberately targeting settlements and individuals that posed the greatest threat to their expansion plans. The undead leadership appeared to be conducting a systematic campaign to eliminate human military expertise, scientific knowledge, and organizational capabilities while preserving useful infrastructure and resources for their own purposes. The Colonel's analysis indicated that humanity had perhaps weeks rather than months before the zombie empire achieved sufficient dominance to make organized resistance impossible. Dr. Williams' latest research provided the most terrifying revelation of all, as her analysis of captured zombie specimens revealed evidence of continued biological evolution that was accelerating at an unprecedented rate. The undead were not only learning and adapting behaviorally, but were also undergoing physical changes that enhanced their capabilities beyond anything seen in the original outbreak. Some zombies showed signs of improved sensory organs, enhanced motor coordination, and even rudimentary healing abilities that allowed them to recover from injuries that would have been permanently debilitating to earlier undead. The possibility that the zombie virus was actively engineering improvements to its host suggested that humanity was facing an enemy that would continue growing stronger and more capable with each passing day, while human forces remained limited by biological constraints and resource scarcity that made long-term survival increasingly unlikely. The final battle for humanity's survival began at dawn on what would later be remembered as either Liberation Day or the Day of Final Defeat, as the combined forces of the Human Alliance made their desperate last stand against the advancing zombie empire at the strategic choke point of Devil's Canyon. Marcus stood atop the makeshift command bunker, surveying the vast undead army that stretched across the horizon like a dark tide of death and decay, their organized formations and coordinated movements a testament to how far their enemy had evolved from the mindless hordes of the early outbreak. The human forces had gathered every available fighter, weapon, and resource for this climactic confrontation, knowing that defeat here would mean the complete extinction of organized human resistance and the final triumph of the Undead Empire. Colonel Mitchell's tactical plan relied on channeling the zombie forces through the narrow canyon passage, where human advantages in ranged combat and explosive weapons could offset the undead superiority in numbers and fearless assault tactics. Elena worked frantically in the field hospital established behind the front lines, her medical team preparing for casualties that would inevitably result from humanity's most desperate gamble for survival. The wounded from previous battles had provided valuable intelligence about zombie vulnerabilities and combat patterns, information that had been incorporated into the Alliance's final battle strategy despite the horrifying cost in human lives required to obtain it. Dr. Williams had developed specialized ammunition and weapons designed to exploit the neurological weaknesses she had discovered in zombie physiology, though the effectiveness of these innovations remained untested in large-scale combat situations. The medical team had also prepared contingency plans for treating zombie infection, though everyone understood that their resources were insufficient to handle mass casualties if the defensive lines collapsed and the undead broke through to the rear areas. Rebecca commanded a mixed unit of fighters from multiple settlements, their diverse backgrounds and training creating both opportunities and challenges for coordinated combat operations against an enemy that had learned to exploit human tactical weaknesses. The zombie forces approaching the canyon showed clear evidence of strategic planning and battlefield preparation, with specialized units positioned for specific assault roles and support elements ready to exploit any breakthrough in human defenses. The undead had even brought siege equipment constructed from salvaged materials, including catapults and battering rams that demonstrated their growing technological sophistication and engineering capabilities. Most ominously, the zombie army included what appeared to be command units that coordinated the assault through complex communication systems, suggesting that the battle would be decided by tactical skill and strategic thinking rather than simple attrition and endurance. Tommy served as a messenger between the various defensive positions, his speed and agility allowing him to maintain communication links when radio systems failed under the electromagnetic interference generated by the massive concentration of undead forces. His reports from the front lines painted a picture of zombie tactical evolution in real time, as the undead commanders adapted their assault strategies based on human defensive responses and battlefield conditions. The zombies had learned to use smoke screens, diversionary attacks, and coordinated flanking maneuvers that challenged every assumption about their cognitive limitations and strategic capabilities. Most disturbing was evidence that some zombie units were deliberately sacrificing themselves to gather intelligence about human weapons and defensive positions, suggesting a level of tactical sophistication that rivaled the best human military planning. The battle raged for 18 hours as wave after wave of zombie attackers crashed against the human defensive lines, each assault more coordinated and effective than the last as the undead leadership learned from their failures and adjusted their tactics accordingly. Human fighters found themselves facing an enemy that combined supernatural endurance and fearlessness with increasingly sophisticated tactical awareness and battlefield adaptation. The zombie forces demonstrated the ability to coordinate complex multi-pronged attacks while simultaneously conducting reconnaissance and intelligence-gathering operations that provided their commanders with detailed information about human capabilities and weaknesses. As ammunition ran low and defensive positions began to crumble under relentless pressure, the Human Alliance faced the terrifying realization that their enemy had evolved beyond their ability to defeat through conventional military means. The turning point came when Dr. Williams' experimental neurological weapons proved devastatingly effective against the zombie command structure, disrupting the communication networks that coordinated undead tactical operations and reducing organized zombie units to confused and disoriented individual attackers. The collapse of zombie coordination created opportunities for human forces to exploit, as experienced fighters used their tactical flexibility and creative problem-solving abilities to outmaneuver undead units that had lost their strategic direction and battlefield awareness. Elena's medical team played a crucial role in the victory by treating wounded fighters and returning them to combat, while also developing field treatments for zombie infection that prevented human casualties from becoming enemy reinforcements. The battle's outcome remained uncertain until the final hours, when coordinated human counterattacks succeeded in destroying the zombie command centers and breaking the undead army's organizational structure. The aftermath of the Battle of Devil's Canyon marked a turning point in humanity's struggle for survival, though the victory came at enormous cost in lives and resources that left the human alliance severely weakened and vulnerable to future zombie resurgence. The destruction of the undead command structure had disrupted zombie coordination across vast territories, but intelligence reports suggested that other zombie empires were already forming in distant regions and learning from the tactical lessons of this defeat. Marcus and his surviving companions faced the daunting task of rebuilding human civilization while preparing for future conflicts against an enemy that continued to evolve and adapt with each encounter. The battle had proven that humanity could still triumph against organized zombie forces, but only through unprecedented cooperation, sacrifice, and tactical innovation that pushed human capabilities to their absolute limits. As the survivors began the long process of reconstruction and preparation for future challenges, they carried with them the knowledge that their victory was temporary and that the ultimate fate of human civilization would depend on their ability to evolve and adapt faster than their undead enemies in the ongoing war for planetary dominance.